Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. If you're a regular listener, then you'll know that I have a pretty eclectic mix of guests on the show. And my guest this time is going to prove that point admirably, because he's not just here to talk about one thing, he's here to talk about three. I first became aware of Dan Kaszeta when a thread he posted on Twitter went viral. He's an American living in London. Sting, if you're listening, he's a subject for a remake of Englishman in New York. Dan had a bit of time to kill before lunch and went for a walk in Tower Hamlets. That's a district in the east of London, which for some reason is often described by people that have never been to the city as being a no-go zone, where the police fear to tread and Sharia law is in full effect. There is no such thing as a no-go zone, and Dan set out to prove it by going in and tweeting about all of the non-Sharia compliant things he found, like bars serving alcohol. His tweet went viral. That story is enough alone to invite him onto the podcast, but there's more, because Dan is also rather active on Twitter and he regularly gets attacked by people online, partly because he goes in search of those who continue to perpetuate the myth that London has no-go zones. As you'll hear, there's a predictable pattern to how that plays out, which involves them quoting his own thread that disproves the existence of no-go zones as proof that they actually exist. So I wanted to pick Dan's brains on that and the experiences he's had online. Finally, there's a third reason I invited him on. He's just published a book called Toxic. No, not a biography of the Britney Spears song, but rather a history of nerve agents from Nazi Germany to Putin's Russia. It's not just an incredibly fascinating and timely book. The reason Dan is qualified to write it is even more incredible. He's got an amazing backstory that involves working at the highest levels of US government and some amazing anecdotes. As you'll discover, all of these threads come together in what was a really enlightening discussion. So please enjoy my conversation with Dan Kaszeta on no-go zones, internet trolls, nerve agents, and a host of other fascinating insights. Dan, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure. And look, as we were saying before we recorded, any one of the topics that we're going to talk about today is a podcast in itself. And so this, I think, is a fascinating kind of journey. And to help us begin that journey, can you just give my listeners a little bit of a sense of your background?
Yeah, well, my name's Dan Kaszeta, and I've got this very sort of odd CV that has been described as reading like a cheap novel. As you can tell from my voice, I'm not native to the British Isles. I'm from the United States. I lived in a lot of different places in the United States. I guess I still consider Mesa, Arizona to be my home because that's where I went to school and my parents still live there. Professionally speaking, my career started when I went to university. I went to university on a scholarship from the U.S. Army. It was the waning years of the Cold War. The U.S. Army actually paid me money to study Russian. The idea was that I was going to, do military training when I was in university, a very common thing. These Army scholarships were not uncommon. I would serve as an Army officer afterwards. And part of the terms was I had to pass the Russian language exam. The idea being that they were short on Russian language speakers. It was the Cold War. And I did interesting stuff. I ended up getting a degree in political science, but with a minor in Russian because the U.S. has this major and minor thing. And I ended up thinking I was going to be, a spy, an officer in the military intelligence corps, an attaché, something terribly interesting like that. But the Cold War ended pretty much while I was in university. The U.S. Army ended up sending me into the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, which is the branch of the Army that deals with chemical, biological, radiological defense. Surprise to me because I didn't have a lot of chemistry in me. I had sort of freshman year physics, which I got a C in, and this degree in political science. But the Army bureaucracy moves in mysterious ways, and they were in the midst of a panic on chemical and biological stuff because it was the first Gulf War. So my career started as a young officer, a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. And I kept conspiring to get out of that career field and failing. Every chance I got to try to escape out of chemical biological stuff, something ended up dragging me back into it. I didn't end up serving much time on active service. I ended up becoming a reservist, the equivalent of the Territorial Army, quite quickly. Ended up in Washington, D.C., trying to sort of reboot my career back to the things I was really interested in, foreign policy, intelligence, national security stuff, Got a degree in international affairs, passed the Foreign Service exam to become a diplomat. In the 1 year they weren't hiring any diplomats. Applied to be a spy, got a reject letter from the CIA, which I still have.
Awesome.
Ended up as a lowly defense contractor in the bowels of the Pentagon doing chemical and biological defense stuff. But because the original Saddam Hussein era panic had abated, it wasn't a real high priority. But then it became a high priority again the minute somebody started using sarin in the Tokyo subway. And from that point, my career skyrocketed because I just happened to be the right guy in the right place. So, I was Forrest Gump. I couldn't tell you I was a genius in chemical and biological stuff. I was just the one guy in the room who knew what the hell he was talking about, at the right point in my career. So that led me to a much better posting, sort of 3 levels up and with a window in the Pentagon. You're doing well in the Pentagon hierarchy when you have a window. So I knew my career was looking up, but then within a year, I was working at the White House. I was dragged over to the White House military office where I had this highfalutin title, Disaster Preparedness Program Manager. And I was responsible for chemical and biological, radiological defense, at and around the White House complex, which had not really been a serious consideration up to that point. But, the Tokyo sarin stuff had been a huge wake-up call because it meant that chemical terrorism was like a real thing, as opposed to just a hypothetical threat on somebody's whiteboard. Anyway, so I ended up working in the White House military office for 6 years as sort of a mid-grade civil servant. Even though I worked at the White House, I wasn't there in political capacity. I was on paper a Defense Department civil servant. I was still doing military stuff in my spare time. By this point, I was a captain in the National Guard, using my spare time in the National Guard to set up a chemical and biological response team for the state of Maryland, little things like that on the spare weekend. And next thing you know, I'm like one of the guys to talk to in the federal government on practical chemical and biological radiological defense. I'm the go-to guy. And being, of course, at the White House, I had not quite infinite, but nearly infinite access to the best brains, the best studies, the best material, new equipment in the lab. I could have all that stuff if I needed it. So, by this point, I found this stuff really interesting anyway. So, then 9/11 happened, followed shortly thereafter. Some people forget by the anthrax terrorism. There's a whole story to be told there. I might even could give you a whole podcast on that and my minor role in that and the fact that I kind of sort of knew the guy that did it.
Okay, we're going to have you back for that one, Dan.
Yeah, that's a teaser. Well, They tell me always leave a teaser for the next time. And so I had kind of gotten sick of that job, and my colleagues down the street, literally down the street at the U.S. Secret Service, the guys who protect the president, were taking a more hands-on role in this chemical and biological stuff. Made me an offer I couldn't refuse, in a good way. It was sort of like, Dan, we'll give you a badge and a gun and $20,000 more a year. And you just, you got to get a lot more.
Any one of those on their own, we're in, right?
Yeah. And we're going to send you a lot of training, and face it, by this point, I was 33. Okay. You're not getting any younger. The Secret Service is a young man's game. If you give it another few years, we won't have you. This is your last chance. And so I jumped ship and worked in what's called the Technical Security Division of the Secret Service for another 6 years. Saw the world, traveled the world, saw most of it from the back of a black van. It was an interesting time. It was the best 2 jobs I'll ever have, and there were a lot of 80-hour work weeks, lots of overtime pay, which, if I was 25, I would have hoovered it up. By this point, I'm 35, 36. It's sort of like there are points at which I would pay money to I'd pay money to the federal government to have a day off. It's like, saw the overtime. saw the overtime. I'll pay you $500 to have tomorrow off so I can sleep in. So it was one of those. It was a good job. It was an interesting job. I mean, it was fantastic. The training was world class. But at the end of the day, it sucks the life out of you. Byproduct of traveling the world, I met my now current wife, who's British. So it's 2008. We're looking at yet another campaign year, because campaign years are the ones that really sort of don't just suck blood out of you. It's sort of like it's like an organ donor. If you've been through 3 or 4 of them, you don't really have a chance to live any longer. It was 2008, so things came to a head. I proposed to my now wife. I went and got an immigration visa, came to the UK. Fortunately, sold my house in Virginia right at the right time before the true collapse of the property market, so I didn't at least lose money on that. Sold my car, put my guns in a gun safe at my brother's house. Moved to the UK, became one of those immigrants that the Daily Mail rants about. I got a job here very quickly. I mean, my expertise was already known here because I had been a big thing on the international conference circuit. I landed a well-paid job working for a company called Smith's Detection, industry leader of.
They're the people that do all the airport security.
Yeah. But also they make more chemical warfare detectors than any other company in the world. They were making anthrax detectors, And so I went there in basically a sales role to sell to the Dan Kazetas of Central and Eastern Europe. Which I did well. I committed the cardinal sin of identifying with my customers, not the company. And so, without slagging the place off too badly, because they did pay me well, I had a weird reverse commute to Watford from central London every day.
Which is either genius or really weird, or probably both. Right?
Both. Watford is what Watford is. And the irony was it was a job that I could have easily done from home. I'm sure whoever has my job right now has been working from home for 6 months and been perfectly all right. But in 2008, mentioning that you want to work from home, you might as well say, I'm just gonna burgle the vending machine. It was literally the same sort of look on my manager's face. Like, so I was there for 3 years. In 2011, I basically set up my own consulting business, which in retrospect was like taking a Franciscan monk's vow of personal poverty. Thank God for a wife with a job. It's not. I have a niche skill set. I'm very, very, very smart on this stuff. But in a good year, it pays for itself. In a bad year, it doesn't. So anyway, I've had good years and bad years as a consultant. I've had good crises. Never let a good crisis go to waste. I now have 2 books out. The first book is a quite turgid, technical textbook, well regarded by a dozen people, but it was a good intellectual exercise. I've written a lot of things, particularly it's particularly in the last sort of 12 months that I percolated out of the specialty publications into the mainstream. Here I am. I'm not a scientist, but I've got a byline in Nature, the world's most esteemed scientific journal. I got an opinion column in the Washington Post that got all the guys who are still in Washington that I used to drink coffee with, sort of choking it with their morning coffee to see an opinion column by me in the Washington Post. I've been at the Atlantic on the odd subject of milkshaking politicians.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes. It's amazing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I've got dozens of more obscure pieces, but I've written this new book, which we'll talk about later, on the history of nerve agents, fresh off the presses. That got reviewed in Nature. And again, here I am at I'm a non-scientist playing in the scientist field. I think partly because I know how to talk to people, and a lot of them don't.
Wow. I mean, there's so much to unpick there.
Yeah. There's a lot there. I'm looking at the clock. That's the 11-minute précis of my career up to this point.
That is absolutely amazing, and I'm going to take you up on that anthrax story. So we'll have you back if you're willing at the end of this experience to come and talk about that.
Oh, I have lots I can say about the anthrax stuff. Anyway,
amazing.
So where do you want to go from here, Christian?
So I look. I want to start off with the subject that got my attention, where I discovered you on Twitter, because you did this incredible thing, which was you basically went and debunked a rumor that was doing the rounds on the internet, which was that there are these no-go zones in London that are Sharia law controlled that the police don't dare go into. And you did this wonderful thing of just debunking it by what is potentially very out of vogue at the moment, by going and getting some facts on the ground. Yeah. And you produced this beautiful thread on Twitter, which was basically you taking pictures of all the things that might contradict the concept of there being Sharia law. So if I recall correctly, you took a picture of a bar, there was a delivery truck for beer, whole load of things. It went massively viral. And so what I wanted to do was to just unpick that and just go, why did you do that? And how was that? And how's that experience been?
Well, that's a funny thing. I mean, my Twitter account is frankly a flaming train wreck. And if anybody has looked at my Twitter feed and felt, oh my God, what the hell is this? I apologize unreservedly. I somehow have stumbled upwards on Twitter, like Forrest Gump, and assembled a Twitter following of 20,000 people through various different things. Sometimes people came for one thing. There were people who came for my chemical warfare commentary and say, what the hell is this? People have come for various things. But
it's like a Twitter buffet, right? That covers a whole range of...
I mean... I like to think I'm an interesting person, and I hang out with interesting people, and I like to talk about interesting things. I'm interested in a huge number of subjects, so I've become really fascinated with London. I love London. I moved here 12 years ago. I'm in love with this city. I've been granted freedom of the city. I'm a freeman of the city of London. It's the oldest place I've ever lived. It's the biggest place I've ever lived. It's the most complex place I've ever lived. It's got a fascinating history. It's a mix of things. And then when I see these like alt-right weirdos, online, just fabricating stuff and just like, I just can't help but just sort of muck in a bit and sort of say, look, you're talking bollocks. I say, white people can't go to Tower Hamlets. And like, here's Canary Wharf. Who do you think's in all these big office buildings that belong to the banks? And that's in Tower Hamlets. I mean, it's like they live in this other weird world, and other people see it and repeat it. And it's got to the point, what really set me off, actually, was when this actually started to bleed into my day job. Okay. So I run this consulting business. I try to do this chemical, biological, radiological stuff. And I also dabble in actual sort of normal physical security and stuff like that. And occasionally, I get a former colleague from previously in the career, call me up and say, hey, Dan, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I have a fair bit of loyalty to these guys. And this guy I used to work with, I'm not going to throw him under the bus in this. He's a nice guy. He was doing well. Called me up out of the blue. He works for a major U.S. company. And, he's basically now responsible for the protection of that company's CEO and doing all the planning when that CEO travels. Okay. And this guy, who's a normal, regular guy, said, and fairly well-skilled and well-traveled, says to me, hey, Dan, I keep hearing all these places in London that you're not allowed to go to. And, my boss is coming to London for 2 weeks. What the hell do I tell him? I'm like, really? Okay. So it's like, and I belong to 2 different security trade associations. I start asking around. Yeah, these guys are based in London, get these weird queries from their professional colleagues. It shows that this stuff permeates out of the weirdo echo chambers, okay? It permeates into the real world, and we used to think things like Pizzagate, that's just weirdos, until somebody takes an AR-15 and shoots up a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. And, those of us in the real world need to kind of reclaim the space a bit from the weirdos. I mean, when I was a kid, the weirdos hung out basically in the car park behind a very weird bookshop in West Phoenix. Okay.
Hidden away from public view, doing their own thing. Not causing any harm to anyone.
There were odd books in there. It's one of the places where you could buy Mein Kampf. It was that kind of bookshop, and they would host meetings of this thing called the John Birch Society, who's one of his complaints at the time was that Ronald Reagan was a leftist. And so these people would subscribe to odd publications that would turn up, a month later in a brown paper envelope, and they would have furtive meetings. They would have to make a real effort to find find each other. Okay, you'd have to get off your ass and drive to West Phoenix to this place. Now
there's a barrier to entry to the club. As it
were,
right?
yeah. I mean, for one thing, it probably instilled a little bit of intellectual purity in them. It's like the old Klan rallies. I mean, a guy willing to drive an hour into the woods and put a sheet over his head is probably more committed to the cause than somebody who filled out a 5-minute questionnaire on the internet. Okay. I mean, that's just how it is. But now the barrier to entry is nothing. You click no-go zones of London, you're going to find 209 people with like weird digits after the name who swear up and down that they happen, and they'll give you fake maps and everything. So on this particular thing, I had been sort of on a retail level, sort of combating this stuff when it fell across me. As a complete happenstance, on the 1st of February, 2018, a good friend of mine, a guy named Andrew, he doesn't live in London, but he comes into London, likes going to the nice restaurants. So we have this sort of rota fine dining. We booked a lovely spot, and over by Spitalfields Market, Galvin La Chapelle. I highly recommend it. Good. For a place with 1 Michelin star, it's got a not unreasonable fixed price lunch. If you book ahead and just stick to the fixed price menu, and, the wine list goes from expensive to usurious, but, a carafe of the cheap house wine is actually pretty good. I got there half an hour early, and I realized technically, having been arguing with guys about Tower Hamlets, technically this place is within Tower Hamlets, if only
so you are going in, you have gone into the no-go zone in their technology.
I'm like, there's plenty of fodder here to wind up the weirdos. So I just walked around for a half an hour to kill time before Andrew turned up and took a bunch of photos. And, I said, oh, this is too good to be true. I'm going to turn this into a hell of a thread, thinking maybe 20 people retweet this, and somehow it went viral. Several people with lots and lots, sort of hundreds of thousands of followers retweeted it. And then next thing you know, it just went nuts. Within a day, the Metro writes it up as a funny tongue-in-cheek article. Other things like the Lad Bible, which I'd never even heard of, wrote it up, and with a totally tongue-in-cheek headline. And now the thing has gone full circle in that weirdos trying to find justification for no-go zones quote my article without reading it or even looking at the photos.
I absolutely love, because it literally, they kind of go, see, I told you, and you can. This is what's worth following. It's great spectator sport because it comes flying in. Yeah. And then and you can kind of, there's a sort of predefined script, which is you kind of go, prove it to me, and then the first bit of evidence they throw back at you is an article they clearly haven't read or understood. That happens to chronicle your journey proving the opposite.
It's like a massive bear trap, and I put a big sign up here, warning, bear trap right here, and I say, look, there's no bear trap, and then they end up in the bear trap. I mean, it's I'm sure this is the oldest form of humor since like Neanderthals. Neanderthals probably had their equivalent of bear traps. Oh, hey, look, no bear trap there, no bear trap. And some idiot other Neanderthal goes and falls in the bear trap. And they laugh about it for the next 5 years over the campfire. This form of humor, it's pure comedic gold. It got me a lot of followers. It occasionally now it gives me enough followers that when I say something saucy, it occasionally goes viral. I refer to Ann Coulter as the Dollar Tree Eva Braun, and that went completely stratospheric because Bette Midler retweeted it. I mean,
there you go. That's sort of that's the royalty endorsement.
Yeah. So the no-go zone thing. I don't like contrafactual conspiracy theories anyway, but they range on a spectrum of, plausible, just not right, to absolutely outlandish, but this particular one is just a bee in my bonnet because, I live here and it's like, people who've never been here in their life are objecting to my description of my own perceived reality out my window.
You only live there.
Yeah. Yo, you must be a Muslim. Here's a picture of me of pork and alcohol. What kind of Muslim? Oh, I have a job. I have a part-time job in a church. What kind of Muslim does
which
that?
You're not shy about talking about either. So it's not like it's a hidden secret.
I have it in my Twitter profile. And somebody basically tried to dox me to the Archbishop of Canterbury as if he could sack a part-time furloughed verger.
But I mean, this whole thing's fascinating. So I love this idea of, putting out a counter narrative. So to your point, how do I educate myself about this?
Yeah.
So in fact, let's go back. You've seen a warning sign, right? Which is someone that's smart, that quote unquote ought to know better based on all the sort of normal indicators.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, where's he got his information from?
Yeah.
And the answer is, if you go and research this stuff, and what's the most logical way to research stuff nowadays is you just Google it.
Yeah.
Then you're going to produce these things, which kind of acts as so what you're doing is kind of producing the facts. So almost, and I should have done this actually before. I haven't Googled no-go zones London to see where you come out in the search. But I imagine it's pretty high up, right?
Well, usually, because Google sort of stacks, Google's algorithms aren't the same for everybody, but I've tried this from sort of...
I'm going to do it now as we speak. Yeah. It's a live experiment.
Yeah. You're probably going to get my Metro article, and you're probably going to get my Bellingcat post that debunks a lot of the fake maps.
Right, you are number on my search. You are number one. Number one is debunking maps. Bellingcat debunking maps of alleged Islamic no-go zones in London. And then you've got this was my favorite one. This was the one I think that really sort of grabbed my attention, which was the Metro. Which for those people not in London is a sort of a tabloid that kind of recycles internet news that's available for commuters. Well, at least was in the old world. Fearless man risks life by venturing into London Sharia quote no-go areas. And of course, that's what they jump on, because they don't bother reading anything else. So the headline, which is massively tongue-in-cheek, basically suggests that you have done that. You've taken a massive risk. Whereas in fact, the joke was there was no risk at all.
Yeah, exactly. It was basically two blokes going for a Michelin-starred launch on a very cold Tuesday in February. But here I've managed by appearing in the number one and number two in the Google search, I have reclaimed the narrative for the actual factual mainstream, which is, I call that a huge win. I've set out to do that, and there I have, I've done it.
But it's really interesting, though, because it's not the logical approach would be to say, let's ignore these people, right? They're talking utter nonsense.
Yeah.
And what you've proven is that they're not sitting in the car park behind the bookstore.
No.
Right? They're actually really dangerous, because actually this, as you say, this seeps into the mainstream.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about fake news, this is genuine fake news as opposed to what certain other people, high-profile people might call fake.
Yeah. Okay.
And so there's a really useful lesson here, I think, which is if you let this stuff go, it's not like the ramblings of a lunatic sitting in a corner talking to. This is serious stuff that impacts how lots of people think. And so what we need to do is we need to fight back and actually take this stuff seriously, recognizing the audience it has. And so the way you do that is reclaim the narrative by kind of, it's almost like grabbing, you sort of, we need search engine optimized facts as opposed to search engine optimized non-facts.
Yeah. And the internet giants that run the plumbing of this stuff are only just now coming around to realizing how this stuff works. I mean, Twitter is just now getting to the point of sort of squelching this ridiculous QAnon stuff. But like you said, I mean, if it was just three guys down in the pub having pints and talking about David Icke and how the Queen is a shape-shifting lizard, that's fairly harmless, and it happens. Okay, but if your brother or sister or mother rings up and says, "Don't wear a mask; it's part of a conspiracy," or the lockdown is bogus; it's really 5G making you sick. There's real world consequences to that. And it's, we're at this point where, radicalization doesn't happen in a training camp in Syria. Radicalization is largely a self-radicalization where, people get into this confirmation bias feedback loop looking at shit that makes them angry on the internet. You know,
but it's even. But I mean, to your point, right? It's even. I could go. That sounds really interesting. I will check this out for myself, right? So you're actually potentially. There's loads of people that won't do that, but even if we're being, there will be a swathe of people who genuinely are trying to inform themselves. And you've made a really good point, which is, well, where do they go to inform themselves? What sources do they have available? So even if you have the critical faculties. You're up against a sort of narrative that is very difficult to counter because what can you search for? It's not natural to search for the sort of go, disprove this theory to me. You're going to search for the way the internet works is the search terms is going to be the thing you're looking to understand.
Yeah.
You're not going to naturally go, produce me counter arguments for something that I'm looking for.
All right. And this is a perfect way. And I'm going to do a little bit of your job for you. We're going to segue from this into sort of where this intersects with my sort of core life's work. One of the first ways I started getting Twitter followers was the fact that in my area, chemical weapons was no longer just a thing of the past. August 2013, a massive nerve agent attack happens in Syria, in a place called Ghouta, and almost immediately, conspiracy theories, misinformation. And misinformation is just information that's got a mistake in it. It could be benign, just people just don't know any better. And also deliberate disinformation all start spreading very, very quickly after that. And I started becoming. This is when I really started leaving my niche as a chemical warfare expert, well, not so much that I'm still in that niche. The rest of the world became interested in my niche because I was one of a handful of people on this island that can talk about this stuff and can talk about it in a way that isn't sort of normal people language, but not dumbed down. So I can finally calibrate this. There are brilliant boffins. There's some of the best scientists in the world in this country, but some of them you cannot put on television. Some of them you cannot put on radio. Some of them you can't even get them to write anything without a serious edit. They need to be chained up in the lab. That's where their best outlet is, and they're not employed to be public advocates of their science. Few scientists are. So I found myself fighting this one-man battle against a lot of huge amounts of misinformation, conspiracy theories, trying to cover up the fact that the Assad regime in Syria is using nerve agents. I got a little bit famous by that because I was helping out this guy named Elliot Higgins, who became the founder of Bellingcat. Well, I have been all along. I've been Elliot Higgins' chemical warfare specialist. And he kind of threw me to the wolves and said, listen, and when the media is asking him about the Syrian war and chemical weapons, he said, no, you really got to talk to Dan. I'm just, I'm a generalist. Dan's a specialist. So next thing you know, I'm on the television. I'm on the radio. I hate doing television. I don't even like doing radio. These podcasts are great because I have time to explain myself. I'm better in long form. If somebody wants 300 words out of me on something, I have a hard time. I can condition myself to do a 2,000 word article on something, but doing 300 words and trying to have value and have it be specific,
Right, but because it's complicated and nuanced.
Yeah,
right?
It's because
dumbing down. I think that's part of the problem in the world nowadays is stuff gets dumbed down. So, we could talk about Brexit. We won't because we'll be here forever. But there's a good example of something that sounds incredibly simple and lots of slogans around it, where the reality is massively complicated. So, I think in a way it's a refreshing antidote to the thing that goes, actually, trying to summarize this thing is really hard. Because there's a level of nuance and complexity.
Yeah. I mean, the real world is complicated. The real world is really messed up. And this goes back to our previous talk about conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are an intellectual construct to find a simple solution for a complicated world. Most of them are. The oldest conspiracy theories certainly are. The oldest canards, the oldest conspiracy theories tend to be things like anti-Semitism, that tries to explain bad things in terms of, well, those people with the other religion did it, the plague, oh, they did it, missing child, oh, yeah, they did it because they secretly have human sacrifices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get into the 1600s, 1700s, a vaguely secret society, the Freemasons, they become a complete whipping boy for this because they are secretive. Okay, anybody who's secretive becomes a target for this, they're the secret guy. they're the secret guiding hand behind everything, or the Rothschilds or George Soros. I mean, some people I think have this mental block about getting around the world view that bad things sometimes happen for no reason. Okay? Bad things can happen for no reason. And they want to put agency behind these bad things, and some really awful, horrible things happen. But, it's really hard to blame people for earthquakes, but some people do, I mean, it's bad enough because there are bad things you could blame on people. I mean, it's not like we're short on that. Right. But it's a stretch. It's a stretch to take all bad things and blame them on people. And things that are bad and done by people that are done by a lot of different people not really working together. That's hard to get around. I mean, people are doing climate change, but it's no one person. It's sort of the sum total of human society up to this point has led us to this bit because we didn't know what we were doing for much of our history. And now we're figuring it out. Like, what the hell do we do now? So it's, but anyway, so this gets back to the whole thing where, my first duels in public on conspiracy theories and weird stuff weren't no-go zones. They were on these whether or not Assad did these chemical warfare attacks. And I find the same internet trolls trying to effectively relitigate the same stuff over and over and over again, even though it's been firmly settled at lots of different levels, and coming at it with what they think is a fresh angle, but it isn't really, because these guys don't know what they're talking about. They haven't thought the whole thing through. I actually have, because I've had years to think about this. It's the sort of thing. Somebody thinks about something for 5 minutes. They're trying to come up against me in my niche, for example, the current thing is people claiming that tear gas is a nerve agent. Okay. Right. And they've got 5 minutes of Google, if that. If they had 5 minutes of Google, they would know it isn't. If they would actually just read the generic Wikipedia page on nerve agents and read the generic Wikipedia page on tear gas and get through the first paragraph of both of them, they would realize, this is not really the same thing. Okay. But they don't even bother with that. And they come up against me. Who are you to tell me? And
I love the way you deal with this, which is, let me just list the many reasons why I know what I'm talking about.
Well, and I do that on purpose because then other people can use that deliberate debunking as I've crafted a cricket bat that somebody else can pick up and use. Okay. Here I am. Who are you going to believe? Something you heard on the internet from somebody, or my peer-reviewed article in Nature on tear gas, okay, or my new critically acclaimed book on the history of nerve agents, or any one of these other learned textbooks that don't have my name in it. Oh, by the way, one or two of them actually footnote me. Okay, right. Okay, stick my name in Google before trying to joust with me, you idiot. So there's a lot of fundamental laziness involved in this stuff. So here I am in this weird. I somehow clawed a messy living out of chemical warfare punditry, for lack of a better term. I somehow now make a living out of it in that it led to me getting a book contract to write about the history of nerve agents, and an advance on the book, which is rare these days, especially in nonfiction. I get routinely invited to speak at conferences. Every year, the European Union has me over to Brussels. This time it's going to be on Zoom to evaluate learned proposals on things that are in my area because they need help on how to spend their money wisely. I've been doing that for years. Fortunately, my status with them is as an individual, so Brexit isn't going to screw up that bit of my employment. I write articles, it's now to the point where I don't have to pitch an article, and now it's sort of, and the people who want free content from me, I can really tell them to F off. Okay. Right. It's like, I mean, some of the things I get paid for was a bit, derisory, but, that's a rough world out there. People come to me wanting content out of me, and I'm at the point where I can pick and choose. I've got a revision of my first very learned textbook, which is on how to protect major public events from these kind of hazards. I've got a revision of that now. I've got a contract of that going. I got about a year to revise my first book. I want to pitch a book on the history of tear gas, because tear gas is a thing, it's clearly a thing where there's a lot of myths and misconceptions, and the history isn't necessarily understood. So I want to do for tear gas what I just did for nerve agents in my book.
Let's talk about toxic, because it was like, if you'd said to me at the beginning of the year, you will be reading this book, about this topic, I kind of would have gone, yeah, not so sure. Yeah. And actually, I read it part because I saw you'd written it, and I'm like, he's someone that I find entertaining and interesting, and it's clearly targeting, a sort of a really interesting facet, I think, of the world. But there is an interesting kind of human risk angle on it, which is this is a misunderstood thing. Yeah. And your book beautifully debunks it. So can you talk a little bit around what's the genesis of the book, and what are you covering?
Okay. The genesis of the book goes back some years. When, I'd done my first book, which sells at about $80 and gets bought by university libraries. It's not The Road to Riches. But I wrote a very good 447-page book with a real publisher, Wiley. I have to point out, Wiley the publisher, not Wiley the now discredited grime star, who I didn't even know existed, because I just live in a different world from that. Going through my back tweets, here's my book with Wiley. It's like, anyway, right. I did that at a point where I'd quit Smith Detection, didn't know what else to do with my life. And so I wrote that, so I have the discipline in me to write a book, but I also know that books in this area don't sell terribly well. And I'd always wanted to do something on the history of nerve agents, particularly once, it becomes a thing again with the Novichok stuff. And that was sort of my next sort of leap to fame was, the Salisbury stuff. And all of a sudden, I'm practically the only person in the entire country who ever used the word Novichok on radio, TV, or in print, like ever before that happened. Okay. So again, I had another media circus and all that. I managed this one better because I remember the lessons from the previous. Hold out for an appearance fee. Don't do TV because it's a time waster. This whole, we'll send a car to pick you up. It's central London. It's gridlocked. I'm going to walk. Don't act like that's an inducement,
Right. Well, the reason you need a car, Dan, is because there's no go zones. Yeah. Right. So you need to get through those, clearly.
Yeah. So I don't like doing television, Anyway, so I knew a fair bit about the history of nerve agents, and I knew there were some fascinating stories there. And they've been hit at a little bit in some other books in the past. But, the last major book that, talked about the history of chemical warfare was a book called War of Nerves. It was a very well written book by a lovely guy named Jonathan Tucker, who's now no longer with us. But his story ends in sort of the early 2000s, and he didn't have access to a lot of the archival stuff that it turns out I could get access to. And I didn't think I was ever going to write a book like that. I pitched it to an actual book agent in New York, circa 2014, back when Bloomberg was actually paying me money to write a serious opinion pieces on Bloomberg View about the Syrian conflict. But good gig, but they were giving me a huge amount of money to write a few words, and I got some real hate mail off of some of the things I wrote. But anyway, I found through my growing Twitter contacts, I found an actual book agent. I wrote up a proposal for writing the history of sarin. Sarin's the thing, used in Tokyo, used in Syria. Other people have done single subject history. This guy named Mark Kurlansky wrote the most amazing history of salt. Okay. Wow. It's a fascinating book, as this other guy, C.J. Chivers at the New York Times, who I now know, and was one of my inspirations for this, wrote a singular history of the AK-47 assault rifle. And it's actually a brilliant book. So there's precedent for the one that is sort of, if you will, a vertical, on this. I pitched it, and they said, "Oh no, the publishers won't touch this with a barge pole. They're going to think it's a how-to manual or whatnot." This is a So it was as if I threw a dead cat on the table. Like, okay, fine, whatever. Flash forward to 2018. Yeah, I got to get my years right in my head. The sign of age, a little over 2 years ago. It was approximately June of 2018. I get taken out to lunch by the guy who's now my current publisher for Toxic. He'd found me through Twitter, found my robust commentary on this stuff interesting. And he wanted my opinion on somebody else's book proposal and something tangentially related. I said, it's half a book. And it's so niche, I'll read it, so will 10 other guys. But, I can't in good conscience tell you that this is going to be a good proposition for you right now. And over a nice long lunch, I
you mean a no-go zone just to keep with the theme?
Yes. Well, yes, near Smithfield Market, possibly.
Close enough.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Skirting with danger.
Yeah, skirting with danger. Wherever possible, I'd really try to gouge Michelin-starred lunches now. And this was, and anybody out there wants to buy me a Michelin-starred lunch with lots of wine, I will talk at you for 2 hours straight. The deal right there.
There we go. There's an offer.
Yeah,
right.
It's sort of like my audiobook offer. Give me enough money, I'll get my friend Gary, the actor, to read it on a loudhailer in front of your house.
Lovely. Like it.
Anyway, so the idea was, he just asked me, well, Dan, you clearly can write. Do you have a book in you somewhere? Because this guy's job is at Hearst. He's the head guy. He puts out 70 to 90 books a year on various learned subjects, mostly current affairs stuff, some history, And so I pitched the idea. Hey, there's a whole history here. It's fascinating because it's got drama. It's got weird characters. It's not just all technology and science. I mean, I personally find the industrial history of the stuff fascinating. Somebody described me as the Fred Dibna of chemical warfare, a reference
which will mean absolutely nothing to vast swathes of the audience. But I'll put a link so people. He's a fascinating character. I'll put a link in the show notes so people can see who he is.
Yeah, and I really, you see, if a lot of the stuff was a lot of physical infrastructure was still in existence from the old chemical warfare programs, I literally could go around and be the Fred Dibna of the whole thing. But nobody pays for that sort of thing. So, but I said, let me have a go at it. So I did through the whole formal book proposal, chapter outline, sample chapter, and not just Mike, my publisher, but the people he sent it to were all hooked on it. Said, fine, here's a contract, here's an advance, give me a book in a year. And so, and I did really, really, really hardcore research in the National Archives in Kew, where I don't even think the UK government realizes that some of the stuff that's lying there to be summoned because it's poorly indexed. And I got really lucky early on and just started pulling threads on things. That's how, it was good, proper history. People say nerve agents. Oh, it's not a science book. I'm not a scientist. My academic training is in political science, international affairs, history, politics. So, I can lay claim to be a historian now that I have a history book out and a quite well peer-reviewed one. So it's a history book with some science. It's not a science book with history. Okay. Science books are a different beast. I've read them. And the thing is, I'm filling a niche. There's not a book on nerve agents. There's not a history of nerve agents. There's slightly wider, older books on the history of chemical warfare. And around a lot of them tend to be centric on the First World War, which it was a big thing in the First World War, and everything else was a bit of an afterthought. So I've got this thread, and I think also once my publisher found out I have two of the three in the trifecta of British publishing, which is the trifecta is sport, cats, or Nazis. I've got Nazis and I've got dead cats. I can't really work sport in it. So all this joke in British publishing seems to be my Nazi cat won Wimbledon.
Right? Yeah. Bestseller.
Yeah.
Right.
Fly off. I got the word Nazi on the front cover. I don't have a dead cat in the front cover, but I got a rabbit in a cage. That's almost good enough. And I clearly have dead cats in the in the early chapters because the Nazis. It's a funny story. They wanted to use Barbary apes, proper like baboons, but their only source of them once the war started was via Franco, the dictator, and he started price gouging for them. So
never trust a dictator, right?
Yeah. Otto Ambrose, who was the wicked chemist behind it, referred to him as that Spanish mendicant.
Nice.
So cats it was, also dogs. I ended up in my research. I ended up reading this odd bizarre book called Animal Welfare in the Third Reich. But, in the bibliography of my book,
Love it. And look, one of the things I thought was really interesting was I'm not, as I reflected as reading, I came with a load of sort of presumed knowledge on the subject based on movies and kind of news and what. So it really wasn't a particularly sophisticated gathering. And so what I thought was really interesting was you debunked, back to the misinformation piece. There were quite a few presumptions I'd made about the nature of it when it was used. And, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting was this sort of idea of it's a pretty blunt instrument. And if the wind changes, you could be in all sorts of trouble. That stupid comment really, but it hadn't really occurred to me. I hadn't thought about it. I kind of assumed that this was a sort of lethal thing, but you have to be really careful when you deploy this stuff. And then the second thing was it's easy to, in theory, the chemicals, the chemistry of it is really easy, but the practicalities of large scale. So both of those things I thought were for sort of fascinating examples of the kind of things that, I'd come to it with this kind of history of quote unquote understanding that you just hugely debunked. I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, there is a residual folk history. There's a residual folklore of chemical warfare that comes to us from the First World War. Okay. And that is with us now, and we have these, and we have the old sort of World War I movies like All Quiet on the Western Front and things like that. The thing is, the reality behind chemical warfare is more mundane and squalid than any of this stuff. And see if I can. There's a couple threads here for me to unpack. One thread of this is that chemical warfare has never lived up to the claims of its manufacturers, and promoters. All right. Even at the beginning, in the middle, at the end, the perceived benefits pushed by its proponents never actually, the reality never lived up to that. Okay. So that's one thing for a variety of reasons. One is the unpredictability of it because, the wind can literally shift. The second is even to this day, there is no chemical compound that is the perfect chemical weapon. But everybody was always panhandling for more money, saying, we just need a little bit more research money. We'll make you the first one. I mean, chemical warfare was less devastating in the First World War than many people generally believe. Okay. When you actually look at the numbers, 20 million people died in that war. Okay. And so one of the things is, earlier, a few years ago, I said, well, how many people of that 20 million actually died from chemical weapons? I reckon that nobody would actually know. I wouldn't be able to figure this out. But I found this fantastic study from 1927 by a colonel named Colonel Gilchrist from the U.S. Army Surgeon General's office, who had done, even at that point, it was a historic study of chemical warfare casualties in the First World War. And the thing is, and he went through records, of all the major combatants in that war. Now, some of them are more estimated than others, but the French, the Germans, the British, the Americans, Austria-Hungary all had good records, okay? Because people die, and eventually the dead bodies get reported. The Italians were a bit of a mess in the record keeping. The Russian front was a bit of a mess, but and he caveats, so those were estimates, but he was very good to outline his methodology and the data sources he uses behind his estimates. But his estimation was that, of this 20 million or so combat dead, or missing in action, never found again, 91,700 was the total of, lethalities from chemical warfare. And also, you look through the history of the battles of the First World War. It's a well-documented war, okay? It was one of the most thoroughly photographed wars, It was one of the first wars where everything was teletyped back to news agencies, okay? People didn't have to wait for the ship to come back from India to get the account of it. It's really hard to find a particular battle anywhere that was won or lost based on chemical warfare. Arguably, it was a factor in part of the Caporetto offensive in the Italian campaign. But even then, it's more of a contributing factor. And the Italians lost a lot of people in that one battle because the Italian gas masks were ineffective. But if they had better gas masks and better training, the conventional wisdom, they were still going to lose that battle. So, and so at the end of the First World War, there's a lot of new technology that was used in that war that was considered either effective or had the promise of being effective. Machine guns, tanks, aircraft, U-boats, It's a war where all of a sudden it's not sailing ships, it's big dreadnoughts powered by coal or oil. Okay, so these are all technical. Those were all more successful inventions than chemical warfare. Even if some of their hype was a bit overhyped at the time, there was definitely prospect. Everybody knew that basically every 3 months somebody was coming up with a better airplane. Every 3 months during the last 2 years of the war, somebody was coming up with a better tank. Okay. At the end of the war, chemical warfare was less effective than was first used because by then everybody had a gas mask. Okay. So chemical warfare is one of these forms of warfare where actually a well-trained army can relegate it to an operating condition as opposed to a serious threat. Okay. I've always argued, and I have these arguments in sort of military doctrine circles, because I have as much grounding in military chemical defense as anybody else. It's where my career started, and some of my best friends and allies in this are now sort of colonels and lieutenant colonels in that field, and I get a foothold in that sort of area of commentary. I argue that for a well-trained and equipped army, and chemical warfare is less of a threat than hot weather, cold weather, or infectious diseases, or insects. Things like malaria, yellow fever, dengue. These things can devastate an army. Cold weather can devastate an army. Hot weather can devastate an army. Those things can all be, but they're all operating conditions that you can train against and equip against. Same thing with chemical warfare. Okay, you can train against and equip against it. And this is why, really, in the modern era, the only places where it's been used in the battlefield with any kind of military success were the Iran-Iraq War, because the Iranians were poorly equipped for it. Some of that was basically you can't take a 1970 vintage U.S. gas mask with expired filters in it because they can't get new filters for it because it's old and it's embargoed, and fit it on over a big Revolutionary Guard beard and expect to survive. Okay. And they didn't even have enough gas masks anyway. They were embargoed by the rest of the world, so they had a hard time getting it. The Iranian military had a hard time getting its act together to defend against chemical warfare, but it creaked into that way. So again, that followed the World War I paradigm, slower, I should say. The Iranians managed to gradually reduce the military effect of chemical weapons. But all of this doesn't talk about the real atrocities are things like Ghouta and Khan Sheikhoun and Halabja in Kurdistan, where these things are used. These things are used as weapons of. Well, I hate the term weapon of mass destruction. Okay, it's a gerrymandered term, but they're used as a weapon of mass effect against people who can't defend against it. All right, even things like shelling and bombing and shooting. People dig cellars. Dig bunkers in their cellars and fill sandbags and lay low, like in Sarajevo or the outskirts of Homs or places like that. It's very hard for somebody to defend themselves against nerve agents unless they have things like gas masks. Okay, so nerve agents become terribly, terribly evil in terms of war crimes directed against civilians. I mean, using nerve agents against civilians is a double war crime. First of all, using chemical weapons of anything is wrong, but also acts of warfare against unarmed civilians is wrong too. It's a war crime as well too. So this argument of whether or not that barrel bomb that fell on a certain house contained chlorine or not is It was a barrel bomb that fell out of a helicopter onto civilians. That's, first of all, the underlying offense. The fact that chlorine was the mechanism of death makes that a sort of second crime on top of the first crime. And there's been so much of this conspiracy theory stuff and denialism is just papering over the first crime. Those were conventional rockets shot at the neighborhood in Ghouta. Well, right. Fuck's sake! But sorry if I use robust language here.
No, robust away. It's fine.
Yeah. So at one point, and I at various points, I got to get out of my narrow technical context and say, for fuck's sake, it's wrong to kill a civilian, whether it's with a nerve agent or a bayonet. Okay. Chemical weapons aren't banned because they kill people as warfare. They're banned for a lot of reasons. The fact that they kill people isn't why they're banned, because bayonets are still legal.
We still allow bullets.
Bullets are still legal. Bombs are still legal. One of the reasons why they're indiscriminate is the fact that they affect civilians and military alike. They are indiscriminate. There is a whole arc in modern warfare and modern military technology towards precision. Okay, to precision and accuracy versus area effect. By definition, a chemical weapon is an area effect weapon. Many chemical weapons are effectively the equivalent of landmines because the persistent chemical weapons, including, like, say, the Novichok that was used in Salisbury, these last for a long time after the battle. Okay, the thinking in modern arms control is things like that and landmines and stuff. They're bad. We don't want them. I can't say that from a moral or ethical standpoint that killing somebody with a nerve agent is any better or worse than killing somebody with a bullet to the head. They're both bad, okay. But chemical weapons are they're wrong, but they're wrong for a variety of reasons, and I think I try to capture some of that. I mean, my book, Toxic, is not just about, it's just about the nerve agents. People say, well, what about mustard gas? Well, it's not a nerve agent. What about tear gas? I have to sort of stick to my brief in the book, but I think a lot of the points I make are about broader things as well, too, in there. But also there's, if somebody uses them and then denies it, then the whole forensics of trying to prove it, and in a way that you could do something with that proof. That's a whole question. And that comes up now. And that's one of the reasons why the Salisbury thing was such a hoo-ha. Chemical weapons for so long were thought as a military thing, but when they get used for, criminal acts, how does the criminal system respond to that? And I ask these questions professionally, and guess what? I end up getting seconded to an Interpol working group on this. So occasionally I go to Lyon to Interpol headquarters, eat nice lunches. There's a theme here. Dan Kaszeta, never willingly underlunched. Yes. Apologies to John Lewis. Yes. There are issues here, but also there's a whole theme of safety and health and environmental stuff in my book, as you'll notice. Industrial efforts to make nerve agents tend to become environmental train wrecks that you end up having to deal with for decades after. The U.S. government has turned what had been the sarin factory at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal into a bison refuge. But it's a bison refuge with some serious contamination in the groundwater. And what do you do about that?
Wow.
And you don't build an industrial scale chemical weapons program without testing this stuff, and testing this stuff has problems. There have been several of these big oops things, and there's probably more that we don't know about. Big oops in 1968 when a bunch of sheep got killed in Utah, and there was lots of toing and froing. Conspiracy theorizing on that continues to this day, on that particular incident, the very grimly entitled Skull Valley incident. But there's a whole story to be had here. And, I think I tell it well. One reviewer is sort of, is a bit upset that I didn't really write the book that he wanted to write. But, I wrote,
I wish should have been this. Well, it's not. Right? Get used to it.
Yeah. I made you a nice souffle. It's not a pancake.
Well, I wanted soup.
Yes.
They start with the same letters.
Exactly. So it is what it is. I've had there's some minor feedback. Yeah, I really do need a glossary of abbreviations in it, and if, knock on wood, inshallah, a paperback run comes out, and I'm hoping for that. There'll be a glossary in it. There's a couple of typos that have been found. I mean, the best proofreading in the universe still leaves typos, I found out, But, I mean, it's a good book. I spent a lot of time on it, people I never heard of, are reading it, that's good. It's not published yet in the U.S., but copies are getting smuggled in somehow because they're turning up in sort of offices in Washington, D.C. I am awaiting a North America publishing contract literally any minute now. So hopefully it'll be out this autumn in the U.S. Hopefully there'll be an audiobook, which is more than my friend Gary with a loudhailer. There should be a Kindle book coming out soon too. So, I mean, I feel like a real author. I felt like, I didn't really feel like a real author with my first very, very, dense book, even though it was well regarded in certain niches. This. I mean, it's good to go into Waterston's on Trafalgar Square and see my book on the shelf, particularly the day after some wag on Twitter says, "Oh, it's not the sort of book you find in Waterston's." I walk into Waterston's and find it and took a picture of it. Hey, mate, here it is.
I know it's brilliant. Right? It's a prime example of that. Yeah. They never learn.
Yeah, I mean, the particularly hyper specialized, low grade, easily debunked conspiracy theories are some of my favorite. Like, Vauxhall bus station has disappeared. Here I am. Here's a selfie of me at Vauxhall bus station right now. Here's today's.
But you're part of the conspiracy there, though. Yeah. That's the problem with it.
Yeah, right? or exactly. Or your book will never be in Waterston's. Go to your Waterston's and ask for it, dude.
Right, but I always have visions. There's a lovely thing. Right? The conspiracy theorist would go, the only reason the book's there is because you turned up and you put it on the shelves, right? Yeah. And you'll now take it away before you get arrested.
Yeah.
That's what.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how these things are. Look, that was a fabulous note on which to finish. I would say, as I said at the beginning of talking about the book, it's not something that I would naturally have gone, but it was a fascinating read. And I think really interesting, as you say, in terms of insights around misinformation and some of the other themes that we've copied. So it comes highly recommended from me. Details of that in the show notes. And above all, Dan, thank you for entertaining me, not just on the podcast, but on Twitter. You provide an invaluable source of sort of, amusement that is, some of which is repeat performance, and I love watching again and again and again. Some of which is fresh stuff, but it's always interesting and thought-provoking, as you have demonstrated on the podcast. So thank you so much for all of that. It's been a real pleasure.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Dan for appearing and being such entertaining fun, and to you for listening. To find out more about Dan's book, Toxic, and to see the articles about his now famous journey into the Tower Hamlets Not a No-Go Zone, have a look in the show notes. There's details of all of those things there. If this is your first time listening and you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk Podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the platforms. Any listeners who haven't yet managed to leave a 5-star review for the show, it is hugely appreciated if you have the time to do it. Helps other people find it and me to continue to attract the kind of high quality guests I've managed thus far. If you need a bit more human risk content, then do look out for the Human Risk newsletter. Details of that are in the show notes. Stay safe, and I'll see you very soon.